Hello, welcome back to ERM Advantage. I'm Eric Holmquist. We're continuing in our series on the enterprise risk assessment, specifically the operational portion. In our prior videos, we talked about setup and planning for the assessment process. We talked about developing an overview of a business unit. And in the last video, we talked about how to think about identifying key risks and some related issues. Today, we're going to really put pen to paper, and we're going to start actually looking at documenting these risks from an inherent residual risk standpoint and the related risk treatments, all as foundation for thinking about how we ultimately rate the risks. So let's get started. Okay, so after we've discussed the business overview and come up with what we think is a good working set of key risks to begin with, now we begin the process of breaking these down, starting with inherent risk. Now, for each risk identified, we need the business unit to be able to provide a narrative description about each risk. This narrative, again, provides the support and rationalization for whatever ratings we ultimately assign. If we simply jumped right to high, medium, low with no context, we're back to guessing, and we violated the whole point of the exercise, which is discovery. And believe it or not, as we start to think about describing inherent risk, the business units have a tendency to want to go to talking about their controls. They need to get there because that's where they're used to defending. We let them know that we will get there, but right now we are still in the dark side of the room, the part that theoretically precedes risk mitigants. Reiterate that we're going to get to the light side. We're going to tell that story, but first we have to define the risk itself. Now, there are several things we're looking for in this narrative. We're basically looking for what could happen, what could it mean, and ultimately, why do I care? We'll get to that. So first, a description of the process failure, the what could happen. Again, an example of an unauthorized wire goes out. Pretty straightforward. This is why it's so key to tie to a process, because then the risk is simply how would the process or could the process fail. Second is a description of the potential impact of the failure. This is what gives us our context. Now, this can take many forms. There's really no right or wrong, but the more information that we can gather, the better we can ultimately assess the risk. So, a good approach is to use lenses such as a financial impact, a regulatory impact, an operational impact, a reputation impact. Again, these are not risk types. They're just types of impacts that we could categorize to help us sort of think through what might this look like. And again, we don't need chapter and verse, but we certainly need something more than, well, it would be bad. So let's look at an example. In our case, we're talking about an unauthorized wire. So an example description might be an unauthorized wire, if unable to be retrieved, would at minimum represent a potential substantial financial loss. It could easily lead to significant regulatory scrutiny, and if part of a pattern, could lead to regulatory actions, including fines and sanctions. A sizable enough loss can easily lead to liquidity issues. Customer loss of confidence would definitely be operationally disruptive, and if made public, could lead to significant reputation issues. Again, within here, we could also reference related materials such as other assessments, various scenario analysis, stress tests, anything that might lend insight into the potential impact of this scenario. Finally, and this is certainly optional, but to the extent possible, an indication of potential risk sources. This takes us back to our prior conversation around risk versus sources. Again, the risk is what we rate. Sources are what suggest appropriate controls. It's the how something could happen. Now, certain sources will be common and fairly obvious to a variety of risks, such as employee error, malfeasance, or lack of suitable procedures, training, etc. So you may want to stay focused on those sources that are either, one, most likely, or two, simply least obvious to the average person, those that would increase the chance of an event. For instance, it might be worth noting where a given process is principally supported by a third party, the more likely source would be a failure within the third party. Or say a process that is supported by only one person. Clearly, this could represent a key man risk. And again, that wouldn't be obvious to somebody else. These are worth pointing out because on evaluation, they may prompt some thinking about the possibility of additional mitigants or resiliency factors. For instance, in our unauthorized wire scenario, the risk profile looks very different if the source was employee malfeasance in the wire room versus a customer who's been defrauded, but to the bank, everything seems in order. Both represent an unauthorized wire, but the risk profile and related mitigants and responses may not be the same. Another reason that documenting risk sources can be incredibly valuable, and it supports utilizing the risk assessment data in another way. Recall in our last video, we described how fraudulent anything is a poorly described risk because fraud is not a risk, it's a risk source. It's a how something could happen. However, there are times when you may want to do, say, a fraud risk assessment. In other words, come up with some estimate of your fraud exposure. That's very fair. So, if you do this correctly, this becomes very straightforward. For any given process that is inherently susceptible to possible fraud, simply note that as one of the risk sources, whether simply as fraud or subdividing into internal versus external. Then, all you have to do is sort all your assessment data by the risk sources identified and filter for source of fraud. Boom, you effectively have a fraud risk assessment because you've pulled out all of the meaningful risks where fraud is a factor. You may have to do some additional tweaking to it, but the bulk of the data will already be there. You could do the same thing for keyman risk, third-party risk, any dimension which shares a common source. And at the same time, you're using the same pool of information in multiple and meaningful ways. But back to our inherent risk narrative. This narrative describing both what could happen and some sense of what that could mean, the potential impact, should provide enough information to establish it as a key risk. Said another way, convince me why I should care. If I read the description and it only sounds like a minor or moderate risk, based on that potential impact, then either we don't have enough information or this may not be a key risk, and the business may even come to realize this, which is why we really didn't press too hard when we were thinking about an inventory of key risks, because oftentimes in talking through the impact, they come to their own conclusion that, oh yeah, actually that probably wouldn't be as big a deal as we originally thought. And that's okay. Again, this is a discovery process. Okay, we've spent enough time in the dark side of the room. No one likes it there, but we did what we needed to do. We've defined our inherent risk, both in terms of the event that could happen and the possible impact of it, and ultimately we've decided, yes, we care. Now we can move on to risk treatments, or how we respond to these risks. Now, we're all familiar with the 4 options available responding to risk: avoid, transfer, mitigate, or accept. Once we move past avoid, then we evaluate the two primary forms of risk reduction: transfer and mitigate. Now, for clarification, some descriptions are helpful here, or definitions, if only to provide some definition to our terminology. So transfer, essentially moving the risk from one party to another. The most familiar of these is the use of third parties for certain operational or hedging activities and insuring against specific events. These are effective ways to move responsibility and/or liability to an outside entity, but need to be considered in different ways in the assessment. Then we have mitigation, which is basically mitigating risks generally involves a combination of both objective and subjective measures to reduce either the likelihood or impact of an unwanted event. Objective being things like internal controls that are defined, evidence, testable, etc. Subjective being additional mitigants such as experience, training, instincts, etc. Now, while assessments tend to focus most heavily on internal controls, all these make up a total mitigation picture and ultimately inform risk treatment. Now, I've always felt that the terminology here was a bit sloppy and has led to some confusion, so it's worth pointing out. When we talk about transfer and mitigate, this is what we typically mean. Put in the context of all the options, and it looks like this. But the problem is that transferring risk is technically a mitigation. It's just a different way of mitigating risks. So if we're really being accurate, what we should be saying is that when responding to risks, you have three options: avoid, mitigate, or accept. Then mitigation just breaks down into a variety of aspects, including transfer, internal controls, and other mitigants. Now, I don't like to get caught up in term semantics, and for now it's probably best just to stick with the nomenclature that's most commonly used. But again, as we seek to introduce terms into business units, particularly risk-type terms, we should try wherever possible to not create confusion, and introducing terms that follow an unclear hierarchy or may lead to confusion, which is why I point this out. To avoid potential confusion, going forward, I would love to see the industry start using the three buckets: avoid, mitigate, accept. It's simpler and it just makes intuitive sense to business people. Nevertheless, we describe the combination of these, transfers and mitigation, as risk treatments. This is consistent with the language contained within ISO 31000, the International Risk Management Standard. Each of these terms has a specific meaning, so it's important to understand how we use them and how each is considered within our risk assessment framework. At minimum, we've simply got to get past the narrow and misguided statements like considering all the internal controls are in place. As a side note, I'm actually working on an article, and I may make a video about this, that talks about how simply focusing on testing controls is actually an incredibly imperfect and incomplete way of validating risk levels. Internal controls are only one type of mitigation, an important one, but at times may not be the most important one. Sometimes skills and experience are your biggest risk mitigants. Again, we sometimes lean a little heavily on that language because this is where internal audit tends to focus. But risk management involves a complete, holistic view of risk and risk mitigation. More importantly, just because something isn't a testable control doesn't mean it doesn't count. And sometimes risk can lie in assumptions about those other mitigants. So the goal when evaluating how risks are mitigated is to fully consider all of the potential methods. We're going to take a brief look at each of these types of mitigants because each has unique characteristics that need to be considered when rating them. For instance, things like internal controls are largely focused on reducing event likelihood, but may have little to no effect on impact. On the other hand, event insurance does nothing to mitigate likelihood. It only applies to the impact. So, as part of our analysis, we need to consider how each of these various mitigants is used in addressing risk elements. Okay, starting in transfer and specifically third parties. Now, considering third parties that are used either for outsourcing operational processes or as financial counterparties is fairly straightforward. For operational processes, we want to give some weight to those processes that are moved the responsibility to a third party while giving careful consideration as to who ultimately bears the liability. As the old saying goes, you can outsource a process, but you can't outsource the risk. What typically happens when using third parties for process outsourcing is you're simply changing the nature of the risk from one of execution to one of oversight and governance. Now, I'll have a whole series on managing third parties later, a messy proposition on a good day. Still, the net effect can be risk reduction, but we have to be very, very clear on where responsibility lies for what. Now, transfer to third parties as counterparties, on the other hand, is really much more straightforward in that the trigger event which invokes their responsibility will be clearly defined and is governed more by market conditions than the actions of the counterparty. Again, this is largely converting a financial risk to an operational risk, which includes the vetting and monitoring of the counterparty. Now, each of these types of third parties will ultimately influence reduction of either event likelihood or impact, depending on the contractual role of the third party. Operational third parties may reduce event likelihood if the purpose of the outsourcing is to take advantage of the third party's greater capacity or expertise. However, in some cases, the use of third parties could actually increase risk since the institution is less aware of and has less control over what is taking place. If an event happens that the third party either does not immediately disclose or handles in a way that increases exposure, such as a compliance violation or a negative customer experience, the event could actually exacerbate the impact. But as a side note, this possibility should be considered as part of the inherent risk, not a negative mitigant. In other words, residual risk cannot be higher than inherent. But the ramifications of choosing a third party in the first place is part of the risk inherent in the process, and all this should be described in the risk narrative. Then we move to the transfer mechanism of insurance. This treatment is also fairly straightforward in that insurance provisions by definition can only reduce potential impact. It cannot affect likelihood. Now, this is always contingent on an event actually happening before any benefit is realized. This will become more meaningful later on when we consider types of mitigants relative to the event before or after. Then on to the messy bits. For those risks that we cannot effectively transfer, our options are to either further mitigate or accept. These are the only two options left. So when we say mitigation, basically we're talking about our suite of internal controls plus other mitigants. The area of internal controls is one of the more familiar areas of risk mitigation simply because this is always a focus of audits, testing, etc. Nevertheless, I do see some consistent areas of confusion or opportunities to better understand the control environment in a way that it can affect how we assess risk. Now, we know that controls can be designated as either general controls, key controls, SOX controls. Those are familiar distinctions, so we don't need to cover those here. What we will discuss is the types of controls versus other non-control mitigants because they can have a meaningful impact on how we consider both as risk mitigants and ultimately come to conclusions about residual risk. So first, it's important to understand what is and is not an internal control. For something to be considered an internal control, it should be, number one, quantifiable, number two, evidenced in practice, and number three, testable. So, for instance, a required approval step with a process easily satisfies all these criteria. The expected outcome is clearly defined, and we can definitely determine whether the action is actually taking place. Similarly with things like dual controls, reconciliations, compliance requirements, etc. Beyond these, there are a variety of governing elements that feel like internal controls, and I have seen at times treated like them, but that need to be treated differently. Otherwise, this will lead to inaccuracies in the risk assessment if these two are treated the same. Some common examples include policies. The presence of a policy feels like a control because it lays out guidelines for expected and prohibited actions. However, the existence of a policy does not mean the policy will be followed, only that it exists. The control is the procedure or other process that ensures that the policy is followed and that suitable actions are taken when the policy is violated. Now, consideration should be given in an assessment as to the existence of or lack of a given policy, including the substance of the policy, but full mitigation requires evidence of a consistent policy enforcement. Similarly, job descriptions. As with policies, undefined role clarity does little to mitigate risk and may in fact contribute to it. But having things like job descriptions alone does not guarantee that roles will be enforced. Similarly, there must be some evidence that performance is measured in line with expected duties, including allowed versus prohibited actions. In the same way, limits. Once again, the absence of defined limits, such as lending limits, approval limits, etc., will always represent unacceptable levels of risk. Having defined limits wherever appropriate is a key governing element with related controls in place to ensure that limits are respected. Following the same pattern, we can apply the same concepts to combinations of governing elements supported by appropriate controls, such as charters, training programs, etc. Again, all of these are mitigants, even if not defined controls. Partial credit should be given for the presence and quality of these governing elements, but risk is only truly mitigated when the supporting control measures can be evidenced. Now, as a side note, there are other considerations that I often see sneaking into risk assessments, notably internal audit and bank regulators. Under no circumstances can risk treatment include things like would be caught by internal audit or by the regulators? If it is, something went very, very wrong. Risk mitigation begins and ends with the business units, and there are zero exceptions to this. So, with all this in mind, revisiting our key risk, let's think about what an evaluation of risk treatment might look like. The purpose of a narrative around risk treatment should be seen as convince me not to worry. If the risk is described as having a substantial potential impact, but risk treatment is a little more than we have a policy and a procedure and some training, this in no way provides enough evidence of effective risk mitigation. So for our key risk of unauthorized wire transfers, what might we have? Well, we would start with general mitigants, which is appropriate policies and procedures, including recovery, highly experienced staff, we have training that is conducted, defined approval authority levels, production reporting, maybe some limited liability in some scenarios where, say, things are customer originated, and certainly insurance for certain events. Again, these are some of the more subjective mitigants. And then certainly on the control front, we could evidence that there are systemically enforced limits and authorities, separation of duties around creation and approval, required approval steps as part of the process, maybe callback procedures when applicable. So you sort of get the idea. And again, we don't need super deep details here. That's part of our testing, but just trying to get a basic understanding of what's the business's story about what is used to mitigate this risk. Okay, so we've made it through a conversation about our understanding of the inherent risk and our understanding of the risk treatments in place. For the final portion of this narrative, we need to come to some conclusion about residual risk. The inherent risk question was, what could go wrong and what would that mean? In other words, convince me I should care. For risk treatment, we asked the narrative to describe, convince me why I shouldn't worry. Now what we're looking for is, one, despite the treatments in place, what could still go wrong or still happen? And two, how do we feel about that? This may be one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the entire discussion, but it may be one of the most important pieces of information in the entire exercise. And we'll talk about why on both of those. What we're looking for is some understanding of plausible outcomes that could occur despite the risk mitigants we have in place. Now, this could be due to elements that are simply beyond the business's control, fraud, hacking, etc. Elements that simply don't bear further mitigation. In other words, the cost of an additional mitigant just exceeds the expected loss, or elements attributable to potential changes. What we're ultimately trying to get to is a place where the business unit understands these scenarios and can therefore make informed decisions about whether these are acceptable or not. We have to be willing to ask the question, is the level of risk okay? And if not, what are we going to do about it? What's really interesting is how foreign this concept can be for so many people. Again, if risk appetite isn't routinely discussed, then there may be zero awareness that there is, in fact, a level of risk that can be accepted. The problem is, usually without a clear framework, then the business has never been able to articulate their understanding of residual risk. They may not have had enough justifiable foundation to be able to respond with, look, we know what else could happen. It isn't worth further mitigating. Therefore, if it happens, we'll write the check. There may be even situations where, say, internal audit was recommending an additional control, but given their awareness and ownership of the risk, they have the ability to say, thank you for your input, we'll note it, but we're going to take a pass. Internal audit is not the final arbiter of risk acceptance. The business unit is. Too many people have acquiesced to the idea that, well, if internal audit says that we should add it, then I guess we have to. No, you can decide. This is what risk management is all about, helping to make better business decisions. So when describing residual risks, some would be pretty obvious. Employee errors, for instance. I don't know there's really much value in stating that. It's pretty standard for any process. But other less so obvious elements could be, key staff turnover if there is a key man risk, system downtime, fair game even if they don't control it, because it still could affect their risk profile, a key third-party failure. Just getting these out in the open allows for an open discussion and ensuring that everyone is making the same assumptions about what risks still exist despite the mitigants in place. Now, obviously, for this to be meaningful, institutions have to have some clearly articulated risk appetite framework, which we covered in a previous video. So going back to our risk scenario that we've been considering, what might a residual risk statement or statements look like? Well, certainly, since we're talking about the movement of money, we always have an element of fraud, either internally or in collusion with somebody outside. The wire room certainly could have key man risk if they are shorthanded. I don't know that I would worry so much about a system downtime for this risk, because the fact is that there are existing manual offline processes. Now, depending on the system being used, there could be an element of the potential for hacking that results in external access to the wire system. This scenario might cause us to go back and note it as a possible risk source and further describe mitigants to that particular scenario. The bottom line is, for an event to take place around this risk, it would really take a pretty extraordinary effort and the failure of multiple levels of controls. Now, based on these descriptions, we will need to come to some risk ratings, the high, medium, and low, but we're going to put that on hold for right now until we move over to the rating sheet in the next video. Then we'll come back to this point. But in addition to our description of residual risk scenarios and ultimately an actual rating, the business does need to put a stake in the sand about whether this level is acceptable. So here you've basically got three responses, or three possible responses. One, yes, the level is fine, nothing needs to be done, perfectly fine. Two, yes, the level is fine, but there actually could be some things that could be strengthened, and that's okay too. That's a good takeaway from this exercise. And one the business might not be comfortable with because they feel like they can't say both, that the residual level is okay, but controls could be strengthened. I know it seems strange, but that's a perfectly reasonable scenario. Or three, no, it's not acceptable, and then what are we going to do about it? This is where the honesty part comes in and where you may find yourself back in paralysis mode. The business unit may know that treatments are insufficient, but is fearful of the repercussions of putting that down or saying it out loud. That's okay. They have air cover through this exercise in that it can be framed as having been identified as part of this process, even if they already knew it. And they will develop an action plan towards improvements. It's really important that the business units be encouraged to be truly thoughtful about where improvements could be made, even if existing treatments are okay. And to reiterate a point made in an earlier video, if issues are identified that need work, internal audit, hands off. This issue is between risk management and the business unit, and they will be given a reasonable amount of time to address the issue. If it's not addressed in a reasonable amount of time, fine, you may want to pick it up as an internal audit item. But until then, leave it alone. This is self-disclosed, self-identified, and the business unit has to have safe harbor to address the issue on their own. If you allow internal audit to pick up these self-described or self-disclosed items and make them immediate audit issues, you might as well shut the whole process down because you just destroyed it. No one will be honest ever again. And to reiterate a point from an earlier video, as part of this discussion around this process, the risk, and all of that, if the business unit identified areas where the process could be improved, let's capture that as well. And we might as well put that in the residual risk section. It could also be in the overview where the process is described. But again, this is where kind of takeaways can live, and One of the things that could be described is that the business feels that this process needs some rework or needs to be improved. That again could be a takeaway item, and it may or may not be a reflection of residual risk, but again, let's pick it up, let's document it, and risk can support the resources needed to be able to put those process improvements in place. Now, one final point is worth mentioning before we move on from these narratives. Occasionally, when conducting risk assessment workshops and prompting the business unit to describe potential residual risks, i.e. what could still happen, the response is sometimes a form of, I don't think we missed anything. This is important because this probably indicates that they don't have a complete understanding of residual risk. See, what could still happen is a completely different question than what did we miss? But I often see these getting confused. The first question is simply asking, despite all the mitigants in place relative to the risk, what outcomes are still possible that may or may not be worth further mitigation? The latter question asks whether there are risks we haven't considered or there are potential flaws in our analysis, particularly in relation to inherent risk and risk treatments. Both good questions, but they need to be considered separately. People often hesitate to describe residual risks because they fear that these will be interpreted as things we missed. But we're not. We're talking about scenarios that are still possible that we know about, but simply are not in need of further mitigation. Now, a couple final points before we wrap up our discussion around risk narratives. And one is key assumptions, which you'll see here on the worksheets. As you've heard me say numerous times throughout this series, risk always lies in the assumptions. In each section of the supporting narratives, inherent risk, risk treatments, and residual risk, we also need to be able to capture, where appropriate, any notes on key assumptions. Now, not everything is going to have assumptions, but some may, and they're important to capture where we need to. In other words, factors that could influence any of these descriptions should something change or prove to be inaccurate. So, for instance, say we're describing a loan origination process. There's been some discussion about a significant increase in production volume or complexity. Therefore, an important assumption becomes that the risk description is accurate, assuming the volume doesn't materially change. And if it does, we need to revisit this analysis. Now, what we aren't looking for is things that would be obvious to anyone. For example, that everybody does what they're supposed to do. We all know that. An example for inherent risk might be an assumption about a possible new proposed regulatory requirement that could impact the process. Should that requirement go into force, that could significantly increase the inherent risk. Or assumptions about open staff positions, or that we don't lose any staff, or being able to successfully implement new planned technology. Capturing key assumptions about risks and risk treatments is very useful because these are qualifiers to our risk statements. Not only can they be challenged, and they do highlight factors that could change risk ratings, but they often can be supported by metrics to track any related changes. Should the focus of an assumption change, say staffing, over a given threshold, the business unit then could be prompted to revisit their assessment to determine if the risk profile has subsequently changed as well. And finally, somewhere in these narratives, for each risk, there should be some indication as to whether management feels that the particular risk or risk scenario is increasing, stable, or decreasing. In cases where risks are either increasing or decreasing in their profile, the narrative should provide some rationale for this view. Okay, so let's summarize what we covered in this video and some of the key takeaways. Once again, honesty and transparency are critical and key to success. We simply must create environments where people are comfortable describing their environment, the good, the bad, and the ugly, without fear of criticism. It's the only way we can learn from this exercise. Narratives help ultimately determine and justify risk ratings. So it's critical that they be determined so that we provide some rationalization as to how we come to conclusions on our risk ratings. It's also where we can identify and challenge key assumptions. Assumptions about the process, about mitigants, and ultimately about the residual risk. Now, our inherent risk descriptions should ultimately tell me, one, what could happen, and two, what could it mean? In other words, convince me why I should care. Why are we even considering this risk? Similarly, our risk treatment descriptions should tell me how risk is mitigated, both objectively and subjectively. In other words, convince me not to worry. And finally, our residual risk description should tell me, one, what risks still exist despite the mitigants in place, and is this okay? We could walk away with the conclusion that, yeah, this is where we want it and this is fine, or we could walk away with, you know what, there's still some work to be done, and that's okay. This was useful either way. Next, risk sources and assumptions should focus on less than obvious elements. Again, I don't need to say I assume everybody does their job. We know that. We're trying to identify elements that would be less than obvious to people. Well-documented risk sources also support additional analysis, as we discussed earlier. By defining what areas could be a source of fraud, we could pull out a fraud assessment by looking at those sources, or similarly looking at risks that relate to a given third party. Again, this gives us the ability to use this information in multiple and meaningful ways. Remember, what could still happen is not the same question as what did we miss? Two very good questions, but they aren't the same question. And finally, wherever possible, conclusions can and should include opportunities for improvement, whether in the process or in the risk treatments. As long as we're going to look at a process, we might as well consider the possibility that it could be improved. Okay, this gives us another good place to take a pause. There's a lot here to digest. In our next video, we're going to move to the related risk rating sheet and think about how we assign risk ratings in light of our understanding of the risk and related risk treatments, followed by thoughts on pulling this all together, aggregating the information, and ultimately developing meaningful management reports. So, as always, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we document these risks and techniques that have worked for you. And once again, don't forget to like this video, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you'll be notified when new videos are available. Thank you.